We're just mean. Face it, we're all kind of dicks to each other. I mean, this is not the kind of culture where niceties and politeness are deep down, folks. That's superficial AF, as the kids say. No, friends. In fact, we are bred to be mean, like from birth, indoctrinated and groomed to attack others. Where does it come from? This sense of superiority that can be easily manipulated by the right rhetoric to transition to supremacy. In the next few episodes, I'm exploring why we're so mean to one another, why we're so mean, period, and what we can do about it. I'm discussing the origins of this superficial society's rush to judgment and what it costs us internally and otherwise. A lot of this has to do with entertainment media, but it's rooted in toxic masculinity, which I'll be getting more into in a bit, and I'll cover more in depth later this season. I've discussed this topic in previous episodes, like the human mathematical equation, likening much of this response to our previous trauma. In the episode The Bully Pulpit, I revealed a lot about our culture of accepted and expected bullying, and how insidious and permeating it is. I've discussed the mental and emotional tolls of bullying and being bullied. I've talked previously a great deal about cancel culture, snowflakes, sensitivity, and slurs. In these episodes, I'm putting a slightly different spin and a finer point on it. It isn't enough to just know that we're mean. It's understanding that we get no break from the mean. It's everywhere we turn. It's in school, in sports, in the workplace, in all of our entertainment choices, and even in church. Everywhere you go, everywhere you look, there's a heart breaking with bullying, snarky comments, sarcastic zingers, and punchlines that truly can punch our emotions like a fist. We act like we're in a sitcom, but there is a fourth wall and no studio audience laughing along. We toss our compassion aside because those abrasive and abusive stabs are masked with a laugh track, and everybody ha-ha-has for half an hour and then moves on about their day. We don't stop to think we just spent 24 minutes watching a sitcom where the husband and wife were horrible to each other and everyone else, where ideals of family, community, home, and love are shown, but through a warped, abusive lens of narcissism and unresolved trauma. We don't stop to think that today, more than ever before, we're binging hours of those episodes at a time. We rarely take the time to consider that even within this fictitious story we're chuckling over, we're only seeing a sliver of what their real life would look like. We just see the highlights. Those are for entertainment purposes only, and don't account for the harsh realities of real life that fill in the blanks of the time that we aren't seeing on the screen. We don't see the husband sitting alone in his garage, miserable because he's been berated one too many times by the person who should love and accept him the most, but instead diminishes his self-worth to near self-harm levels. We don't see the wife crying on the phone to her friends about how abusive her father was to her and her husband. He just ha-ha and hee-haw at the punchy one-liners. When we do try to open ourselves up to that reality and adjust our thinking, behaviors, and speech to be kinder, less harsh and critical, more positive, we're berated and bullied because we're trying to be better. Unless we have a strong circle of support, it's easy to fall into the rut of just going with the flow of that toxicity because constantly fighting it takes a toll on our mental health worse than standing up to the bully or, hell, even just becoming the bully. And we never consider that paradox. Why do so many choose silence over standing up for themselves or others? We simply don't consider how damaging even the most entertaining entertainment can be to our frail little psyches. We will, though. Believe me, dumbass. And welcome to the podcast. No, I wasn't being for real, just like Red from that 70s show. It's a TV thing. You know how we hear pit bulls are the most dangerous, vicious breeds of dogs by people who have zero knowledge on dog psychology, dog breeds, or dog training, or dogs? No, they want the big badass muscle mutt to be the problem. The big fella has to be the issue, so then people won't be the issue. It's an easy, soft place to land, stereotypes. a lot softer to land than the truth often. It's just that sometimes softly landing every time can make you soft in all the wrong ways. Even I fell into that stereotype on pit bulls because I know jack all about dogs. I wasn't around a lot of pit bulls or dogs for that matter. I've been not an animal person for most of my life until the last several years where I discovered, albeit highly allergic, I'm a cat guy. But the big, mean, imposing pit bull sure can be scary. Scarier when you think the pit bull is scary and then you aren't at ease in the pit bull's presence, and the pit bull picks up on that because they're dogs and they're supposed to. And then it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy of bigotry I spoke about previously this season. The one where you have this preconceived notion going into an interaction, so you expect the stereotype to be the stereotype, so you behave in ways that sort of bring about the response you wanted before you came in. If you act scared or nervous around dogs, they can see that sometimes as threatening. They're animals just like we are. If you're scared, they're probably scared of you because you're putting out vibes they can't easily recognize. Maybe the difference between sentience and sapience. In those cases, sure, certain dog breeds or any animal, human for that matter, could seem scary. Not as scary as their possibly sociopathic owner who makes them that mean. Yeah, humans are the worst. Give me a handcrafted gauntlet and that pesky time stone I've been searching for forever, and I'll snap us all into oblivion. Give this rock back to Gaia. Yet many of us, even the emotionally intelligent and most evolved of us, fall into this harmful stereotyping of others, much like my pit bull example. It's easier than thinking critically through your fears and concerns. It's easy just to be scared and worried. That caveman brain, survival instinct to fear what we don't know. Except humans have evolved to know, and technology has evolved to help humans know right now. There is simply no excuse for any bigotry anymore. There's simply no excuse for anyone to be mean to anyone anymore. Fact is that most pits I've come across have been gentle giants. Yes, some don't possess the best spatial awareness required to be that huge. A few possibly have some body dysmorphia, seeing themselves as the tiny little lap dogs rather than this great noble beast they are, but for the most part, I haven't seen firsthand the experience to justify my earlier toxic opinions on pit bulls. In fact, most pit bulls I meet that aren't radicalized by asshole owners are sweet and loving dogs just like any other. I know. How could a dog be radicalized? I'm using that word deliberately. We're proving ourselves to be not far more advanced than attack dogs. Docile until we see a squirrel, then rabbit off the chain. This phenomenon of assigning singular, linear, black and white thinking to things like dogs gives us logical permission to offer that same inconsideration to humans. First off, seeing another living being as lesser than is an issue at the core, which needs to be addressed internally. How can we understand it? Toxic masculinity is sort of the blood cell that this level of dehumanization cancerizes. I know I'm making up words, but toxic masculinity has infiltrated almost every aspect of our society, and like a blood cell, it carries with it this disease that fosters that locker room, snap your buddy's ass with the towel rhetoric that breeds bullying. It isn't a male, man, or boys will be boys thing, it's masculinity. And as we learned from previous episodes, we are a yin and yang of masculine and feminine energies. I believe so much of the resistance to today's gender and sexual fluidity is rooted in the peace one finds when one accepts the balance of androgyny. That balance. We have to embrace it. Too many women and men are caught up in their feelings of their respective femininity and masculinity to step into the true harmony of balance and androgyny. This subject has to do with our bodies, our sexuality, our sex lives, our potential sex lives for many. Before they can even begin to process the realities and humanity of a subject, they have to step out of this toxicity, feminine or masculine, of making everything about them and their experience when it primarily affects others. Moreover, the focus on sex and people's genitals and that opposition is disturbing in and of itself. There are a lot of labels, names, and oppression revolving just that issue alone. So much trauma. We label others for just about everything we can imagine. Anything we can think of, we've got a slur for it. It extends beyond the color of the skin, nation of origin, accents, religion, physical features, gender, sexual orientation, any of that. In fact, I'll argue that we've become a culture of criticism. I'll also argue that just like any other bigotry, it's all laced with self-loathing. We label the people we see in the car next to us as booger pickers, the people in the stores trashy, our friends as needy or slutty, our family as overbearing nags, our children as lazy. This isn't just behavior we reserve for strangers or faceless, nameless masses or groups of people. It's people we love more than anything. We're a culture of gossip, shit-talking, two-facedness, and lies. We, the people, you see, aren't a kind people. We judge others, even in the most difficult times, ours and theirs. Take, for example, parenting. How often do we find ourselves judging someone based on their children's behavior in public? Babies crying at the movies, funerals, church, hell, anywhere. And we say, what kind of parent doesn't know better than to take their kid out of the room? Moms, dads, no one wants to hear your kid scream. We didn't ask for that kid to be born. We didn't ask for that kid to be there. Take the kid somewhere else, right? My wife and I are enjoying a rare evening out and a nice meal at a restaurant. We don't often go out. And then there's a table of adults on one end drinking and chatting while all their young preteen children are at the other end watching their phones and tablets. No headphones. What kind of parent? It's easy for us to rush to judgment, especially in situations where the general courtesy and consideration of others is flagrantly disregarded. The goalposts are moved in our polite exchange. It isn't that their kids are loud. Kids are loud. They're kids. It's that they, the parent, aren't doing anything about it to prevent that loud child from ruining everyone else's experience around them. In those cases, our politeness and respect for social convention goes kind of out the window, don't it? Yeah. We glare. We may even say something. If you're a dick like me, yeah. Take the kid to the bathroom, another room, any other place, outside if it's safe, go home. Get the crying child as far away from the important thing that everyone else is trying to participate in as humanly possible. That's why I'm pro-choice, plain and simple. Human rights and whatnot notwithstanding, sure, but look, that is judgmental. Like a new parent, 3 days without sleep needs me glaring at them, much less saying something. We rush to judgment in situations where the lines of right and wrong, considerate and rude aren't very clear. How often have we rushed to judgment to put someone in a box when we simply didn't have all the information needed to make that judgment call? One of the most painfully depressing and abysmally emptying experiences one can go through is divorce. Even in the marriage, if it wasn't healthy, abusive, it's still difficult. And that's compounded exponentially when children are involved. For family and friends, it's shirts and skins. Pick a pen. He said, she said, or she said, he said, they said, they said. That's what that's for. For those directly involved, it's your world and all the securities and all the consistencies you've come to embrace being torn away from you at alarming rates. Here today, gone tomorrow. You have to move, you have to buy new stuff. Can you even afford it? You lose yourself. You lose people if you aren't careful. We can't ever underscore how hard it is to go through a relationship ending. It can be traumatic and impact every single decision thereafter, whether it's about relationships or not. Forever, till the end of time, you have to tick the box on the form that says, divorced. I failed. Our society isn't one that embraces mental health as much as we should today, and surely has it in the past. How many of us, children of divorce, can say we walked away unscathed, unchanged, better or worse? Still, we judge others in their greatest challenges when it's our turn to cry out for anyone who will listen for grace, understanding, and compassion and empathy. We cry out, we beg for it, and yet when the turn rolls around to someone else, we're like, yeah, it's no wonder he couldn't stop cheating, or come on, did you hear how she talked to him? We don't think how biased and prejudiced we open ourselves up to becoming. Catty office talk, snarking over the waitress, Karening for the manager, using Karen, period. It's a simple step-by-step process for selling your soul. Still, divorce is hard, impossibly hard. And when we're faced with having to survive in those circumstances, behind our backs or to our faces, we are met with constant judgment and criticism. Even if we meet them with outward compassion, internally, we just can't stop wondering what really happened. Mine was a unique experience, yet so similar to many parents I've met along the way. If you've been divorced, it was a simple legal transaction that didn't require much mediation, be grateful. There are others like me who had to trudge through a very biased and corrupt family court system in a very backward and small thinking area of an already backward and small thinking state. All the while being held hostage by a judge with a grudge and a narcissistic co-parent who chess pawned their children in an attempt to push me to suicide. All while bleeding my finances too dry to fight legally. Being in front of judges who care more about clearing their docket before tea time and a system that just needed me there as a revenue stream, it leaves one exhausted in every imaginable way. In Overthinking Everything, I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. And part of the cultism in our culture is the cultism of bullying. I've been exploring many different topics and how they relate to the toxic aspects of our culture and how it impacts us individually. And moreover, how did all that lead us here? Part of the toxicity rests in the moral, ethical boundaries, those boundaries that define our true character. Those lines defined either by spirituality or something that we actually do take seriously. As part of this exploration of my own journey through this culture, I've chosen to examine cancel culture and the labels that we allow to define us, and the ones we insist on using to define everybody else. Many of these labels seem harmless, jokes, teasing, or comments made behind the other person's back, or worse, to their faces. They're very harmful to you, though. As I discussed in Finding Faith, is there a victimless offense? Ultimately, aren't we the victims of our own offenses? And we have all committed a lot of offenses in the realm of bullying, gossiping, and toxic speech toward others. That's why when you're talking to your friend or your coworker about your other coworkers or your boss or friends, family, there comes a line where a proper airing of grievances, communicated effectively through facts more than feelings, becomes a total drag-down feelings fest of those people who aren't you or whomever is in the conversation with you at the time. We rarely pause to consider in that moment how the person to whom we're trauma dumping must feel. Are we talking about them this way to others? Surely we are, unless we're to assume that somehow nothing else is sacred to us except for you. Our ethical choices have consequences, if on no one else but ourselves. I can say it doesn't surprise me when a parent caught up in that farcical labyrinth of the family legal system doesn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I see things differently having endured the trauma that is divorce, the family court system, and the custody fight. Those were some of the darkest days of my life. Days where nothing made sense. When the very word justice lost its meaning, when words like rights and freedom just become meaningless. I think maybe you have to experience rights and freedoms and a sense of justice being violated personally to get where I am now, socially, politically, spiritually. Some people need to feel it to get it. As much as it pains me as a progressive humanist to suggest, my experience was mild compared to some stories I've heard, and yet one of the most extreme stories many others have heard. I believe this speaks to how unique each situation is and a deeper reason for why we should hold back judgment. How we deal with this trauma has a lot to do with our experience, past traumas, and perspective. Not to mention what kind of support system you have. Deadbeat dad is a flash judgment we reserve for someone who doesn't take care of their kids. Yet we abuse that slur and we make it about a dad who's behind on child support or dared to live his life after divorce. Exploring these labels we use for others, do we need to have deadbeat dad as a stereotype? So we all have something to avoid? And that logic doesn't hold for any other slur, though. The reality is that label, like most slurs, does so much more harm than good. It becomes one of those indoctrinations where you're aspiring to not be the terrible thing sometimes more than you're focused on just being a dad. That label weighs heavy on men who already feel like giving 100% isn't enough. We don't reserve that term just for the people who get women pregnant and bail. We use it for a lot of non-custodial parents who are trying their very best, and even some who probably could do better. I've heard it used for men who didn't come to a kid's birthday party they weren't invited to and were threatened with police if they attended. Honestly, I want to stand up strong and say, never give up. But it's hard for me to blame someone for just walking away when the fight's too much to handle. You have one life to live. In many cases, unless we're truly dealing with our trauma, our own psychological traumas have made many of our choices for us as much as we did. Those choices brought forth parts of your life, and that's not something you can take back, even if it was something to consider. When that path ends with, I don't see my kid either way, and or I can't afford to fight for them, then the decision is to end your suffering or to find a way to live with the suffering. Who the hell is anyone to judge that? What about cases where parent B is making it impossible for parent A to see the child? If every interaction is a fight caused by parent B, if communication channels are shut down through except attorneys that charge $250 an hour to pass along messages and requests, if a simple "can my mom see her grandchild" is a court date, there eventually comes a point where the fight seems endless. Do you expect that person to be smiley, sunny, and positive all the time? How can you even imagine what it would take for someone to put on that kind of clown mask? When we hear about the drama, initially the divorce news, we're the nosy neighbor. Say, did you hear about Jack and Diane? All this time I thought they were happy. Did you see their Facebook? We want the gossip. We want the tabloid. What we don't want is the truth. We're a culture that seeks validation more than verification. The validation feels good, right? The truth makes us uncomfortable. I judged Johnny Depp for a lot of reasons. I wasn't interested in the truth. He was a woman beater, and not watching his work wasn't a big loss since I wasn't running out to see much of it in the first place, you know? As it turns out, he wasn't, and that truth made me very uncomfortable. Let me explain. My first thought when the initial rumors about Johnny Depp began were objective. Whoa, we don't know the whole story. Having survived relationships with abusive narcissists and even those who tried to physically harm me, tried to murder me, tried to ruin me professionally and personally, those who set out to cause me great pain, I learned a thing or two about stereotypes and perspective. Still, only a few years ago, I allowed social convention and some other personal influences to impact my judgment on not only a fellow actor, but another human being who, as it turns out, went through very similar experiences to what I endured. I felt afraid to voice my opinion that maybe Johnny Depp wasn't someone who fought women, but maybe someone who had to fight back. When I said that out loud, I came across like an apologist for a domestic abuser. How do you walk that line without coming off like an Andrew Tate fanboy? My argument has always been that my story as a victim defies many of your stereotypes, and just like I'm so glad many women are finally speaking out against their many abusers and abuses, I'm also glad more men are standing up and speaking our social truths as well. With Johnny Depp, just like so many of us, if you've ever been with an unstable person who doesn't tend to their mental health and is prone to lashing out, your choice is to take the abuse, fight back, or lock your partner up. I cannot underscore how incapable and unqualified you are of making that decision for someone else in that position. When we're backed into a corner, getting kicked, hit, bitten, scratched, we may wish we had help. We may want someone to be strong for us, but I assure you, no one is capable of judging what someone else does in that position. It's the exact same message the pro-liar, anti-abortion people need to hear. Adoption is just the divorce custody dilemma posed differently. Abortion runs a similar emotional channel as divorce with traumas like abandonment and not belonging. The pro-life crowd doesn't seem interested in that struggle. The one where you get to grieve the loss of a what if before it might have even been and move on with your life and make it what it can be. But no, the religious alt-right in America wants the baby born regardless of any consequences. With the issue of abortion, those who supported overturning Roe v. Wade have seemingly stopped seeing their opponents as people facing an unspeakably difficult decision. When it comes to adoption, I haven't heard as many success stories as I have stories of children smuggled through the legal sex trafficking trade we like to call the American foster care system. Oh, there's another one we don't talk about because we all know people who foster kids, and not everybody uses their foster kids for sex puppets, but a lot more do than you'd like to think about. And if you listen to stories, it's horrific. The pro-liars don't want anything to do with that problem, or fixing our mental health system so that if someone did go down the adoption route, they'd be able to handle the many consequences better. Or fixing our economy so that people could actually afford to have a child without a single child being the end of every single hope and dream they had for their future, and any more than one child is just abject poverty unless your family is rich. So what about the kid? The adopted kid? Yeah, we don't think about that kid growing up with so many questions. Well, at least the adopted kid gets to have questions. Sure, but that argument's devoid of accommodating for anything but that argument. There is no kid until there's a kid. When there's a kid, there's that argument. Not a kid, not an argument. But that deflection has nothing to do with the parents who were forced to have a child and know they have a child out there somewhere, or a child struggling knowing her true parents are somewhere. How will this child ever know if they have a history of cancer in their genes? In an issue rife with nuance, we've allowed it to be whittled down to labels. You're either for it or against it. No nuance. And we judge people, we label them. And that numbs us down. It numbs down our sensitivities. We cease seeing people as people. It impacts our pragmatism. We become as devoid of nuance as we've made the issues we're arguing over. There is no easy or best way. Stop fighting over it. Let people make their own choices, just like they wanted to do with their goddamn masks during a deadly pandemic. Not wearing that gave almost everyone in my family COVID. Their decision to exercise their freedom to choose not to wear a mask killed over 500,000 people. They've set their own moral and ethical precedent. Stop letting the inconsistent and illogical have a seat at this debate table. When a man, for example, faces the dilemma of fighting for years and spending every penny he will earn to maybe get an end result slightly better than not seeing his kid at all, and when seeing that kid isn't quality time, but instead held as some sort of ransom for behaving or not dating ever again, or whatever mind control fuckery the co-parent wishes to inflict, and when all of that prevents that man from living the one life he has, after all, who wants a man who doesn't even get to see his own kids? That isn't his choice. The system is failing. And who are you to judge? Who am I? Who are we to judge when he chooses to live? Because the choice is to live in suffering, end your suffering, or move on. Now, I fought like hell. I made my life about that fight for years. I won. I still don't know how much of a victory it was. Jury's out. I don't ever advise just moving on. Kids, they need you to fight. But I also am hesitant to judge when the term deadbeat dad is tossed around. In fact, if you're talking to me about a divorce or custody issue, you better bet I'm not on anybody's side. I'm slinging a little bit of benefit of doubt both ways, two to tango, every time. Almost. Surviving that situation validated to me the importance of maintaining your own sanity over anyone else's, even your child's to some degree. Put your own oxygen mask on first if the plane is going down. Fact is, if the other parent is so toxic to treat their co-parent that way, imagine the abuse the child will suffer being half that person. And we know that kind of person usually suffers from a lot of unresolved self-loathing. So they hate your half of the child and their half. Ugh. If the less toxic co-parent isn't there to buffer that or show the child the proper way to love and be loved, then all they're going to know is the bitter and angry parent and the parent who didn't care enough to stick around. Imagine how much of that trauma they'll carry over into every other relationship and experience they have. Folks, this was just about divorce and custody. Imagine how broad what we're talking about can be. We're ultimately bound by our trauma, which often influences our personality and perspective more than anything else, unless we seek pragmatism. In this divorce and custody example, loosely based on my own experience, that perspective is drenched in trauma. So much of our existence is filtered through the lens of our trauma, and we hardly realize or even accommodate for it. Even the bitter, angry parent keeping the child away from the other parent is bound by their own trauma. The worst of our natures is bred out of unresolved traumas, many of which we aren't even aware. We compound that trauma with our own judgments and attitudes we form out of that trauma, the labels and names we call ourselves and others. It's this continuous cycle of abuse, either in bullying or judging others, which is abusive to them and ourselves. Maybe because no one showed us grace when we went through it, then no one else deserves grace either? Or maybe because no one showed us grace when we went through it, we want to overcompensate and grow whole grace gardens so you can feed everyone the sweet, delicious taste of grace. Maybe the difference, that what sets people apart, those who flock toward bully cultism and those who are more open to compassion and critical thinking, mindfulness, empathy, maybe a lot of that stems from our own trauma responses. Those who say, I struggled, so should you, versus I struggled, here, let me make it easier so you don't struggle as much. It certainly sounds on par with how we judge others. We either greet each other with criticism or compassion. My argument in these episodes is that only some of that is human nature. The rest is programmed into our brains from very early ages and reinforced throughout our lives. I saw a post shared on social media, an illustration copyrighted by Doug Bratton. It features Doc of the classic Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs fame standing proudly, or smugly, in front of the beds of his fellow miners. The caption reads, Doc, having recently received his PhD in psychology, re-diagnoses his housemates. So the original names are scratched out on the beds, replaced with more scientifically appropriate language. Happy is replaced with euphoric, grumpy with depressed, sleepy to narcoleptic, sneezy to allergic, dopey to mentally challenged, and bashful to social anxiety affected. Cute. Relevant. And I can see it being taken different ways, depending on your perspective. Some would look at this and sneer with comments of snowflakes and talks about how we're too sensitive today, ruining classic stories, woke agendas, etc., ellipsis. However, my medical, educational, and mental health career professionals, the ones who have studied human development for most of our lives, understand that this is so accurate and telling of this social transition. I believe we stand on a precipice of real social change today if we allow it, and now is more important than ever. The generation before mine, and even including my own, grew up with the Seven Dwarfs, as with many outdated pop culture references. I'm not a big fan of cancel culture. It's a cancer culture when we jump to judgment and cancellation without taking the time to learn from it. I'm not saying Snow White should go the way of Cosby. The Seven Dwarfs are, in and of themselves, not all that offensive, other than calling them dwarves. No more than any other fairy tale is what I'm saying. However, labeling these characters the way they were and then identifying the little people by that one characteristics, well, it's a deeper trauma of indoctrination than you might realize. It offers us the opportunity to have a very necessary, if not uncomfortable, conversation. I know, they're fictional characters, but we aren't. And while they live on forever in storybooks, we are left with whatever lessons those stories teach us, the ones we're aware of, and the ones we aren't. Dr. Theodore Geisel was many things, but most don't associate the word hateful to the whimsy of Dr. Seuss. Yet in several of his books, there are some stereotypical, insensitive, and racist illustrations. The Seuss of his early career was a different Seuss towards the back half. The Seuss of old was during a different time than the Seuss of those later stories. This is what we're told of many artists who spanned the 20th century, whose problematic works stood the test of time and are only now being challenged by a society with less tolerance for intolerance and a diverse society now able to speak out without as much fear of retaliation. The organization tasked with upholding the Seuss legacy and name made the decision to cease publication and production of 6 of his books. Half-truths and misinformation spread like wildfire, and most of the voices on dissent, the issue looked a lot like me. None of the images represented me or anyone who looks like me, but me's are the voices of ignorance who were whining about it. This decision to preserve the inarguable legacy Dr. Seuss has had on the world meant re-examining his works to ensure they stood the test of time. That, moving forward, the works that should stand the test of time do, and those that shouldn't and don't push positive narratives should be higher up on the shelf, harder to reach for those who aren't used to doing the work. Don't let that be the low-hanging fruit. Most of his books passed that test. Some didn't. Now, why does this bother us? It isn't like the books won't be available. No banning or burning, just not printing them anymore. Do you realize how many books aren't being printed anymore? Go wiki a library in Alexandria. We're all still pretty pissed about that one. First, we have to understand that we're upset about renaming fairy tale characters or canceling mascots or moving on from unhealthy depictions of other human beings in children's books. It sounds so silly when I say it out loud. But we must seek to understand the opposing perspective, no matter how ridiculous and offensive it may seem. These brands, ideas, things are tied to our emotions and memory centers. Threatening to take those things away causes us pain, an actual pain response, a grief, but a pre-grief, like telling us someone's passing away before they're going to pass away. Even if it's happened. Change is hard for most people, especially those who constantly oppose it. Taking the thing away puts us in a defensive position because it's tied to our emotions, but also tied to our pride. We are losing something. It doesn't even matter if it's important to us or not. All we need is someone to tell us it's important to us. With someone who opposes the change, they're psychologically in this defensive position. Their pride doesn't often allow that, so it quickly becomes an offensive position. To be in a defensive position is to be in a weaker state than the offensive position, even in truth. Football, for example. The defensive position is trying to keep the ball from going into their end zone. They don't have the ball. The offensive position does. The game is won on the scoreboard, not on the stat sheet. The power position is the one with the highest ability to score. That, in most cases, is the one with the ball, the offensive position. So when a very proud people are backed into an ideological corner, they're in a defensive position. Their fragile, traumatized egos, their narcissism, cannot accept weakness or disadvantage, so it's almost like they channel that lizard brain survival instinct to create an offensive position out of nowhere in order to have the upper hand. You have the ball. You're marching into the end zone, right? But in the middle of your series of plays that you're trying to score, the defense lines up in the Hail Mary, with the defensive back coming up under the defensive tackle. A ball boy from their side tosses another ball to them, and literally in the middle of your offensive play, they take this other ball, and then launch a pass down the other end of the field to score. To them, it doesn't matter if it's against the rules or if they left your player completely undefended to score on your side. Only one side is playing by those rules, and they're keeping their own score. That's kind of what it's like to debate with someone who won't accept change, who won't accept a loss, who won't yield when ideologically and factually proven wrong. When they can't win with the argument presented, they create an argument position they can win. We grew up eating Uncle Ben's rice, and if we weren't pouring Aunt Jemima's syrup over our pancakes, we buttered with Land O'Lakes, then it was Mrs. Butterworth's. Unless we had cream of wheat, of course. We played with Mr. Potato Head and grew up watching the Cowboys beat the Redskins. Our granny always had Eskimo pies in the freezer. And that Lady Antebellum t-shirt in the back of your closet? Oh, that was from your first date. You didn't fall in love to Lady A. Actually, you did, because I was in country radio when they were really popular and coming out, and that's what we called them back then, because I sure as hell didn't like saying antebellum on the radio in the southern states. Still, it was a big story for a few days when they made the change. These brands are integrated into our lives. That's advertising, marketing, branding. There is a mind control brainwash science to it that traces back to Nazi research. I've worked in the media my entire adult life. Brand loyalty is the golden goose. How do you get there? I have to hammer it into your brain, tell you exactly what you want, give you what you want, tell you repeatedly, I'm the one who gave you what you wanted. That's sort of the idea with advertising, marketing, and branding. On the surface, today it's more like tell them what they want, ask them limited leading questions to make them think they had a choice in choosing what they wanted, tell them repeatedly you're the one who gave them what they said they wanted, and the others who tried are total pieces of shit and should be destroyed. The more conservative side of thinking, the side which is known to cling to tradition, is unlikely to be supportive of moving on from those ideals. Any ideals. It may not even be ignorance or hate so much as just the privileged attitude that it isn't hurting anything, so why change? They don't see the black bow-tied chef on the box of cream of wheat. It's probably never occurred to them cream of wheat ever even had a mascot. In fact, they might even say, how nice that cream of wheat offers some diversity. Yeah. It's a privileged perspective, but doesn't peeling that back a little help understand that some of these folks aren't altogether hate-filled bigots so much as they're just indoctrinated and don't know no better? We get angry over books we don't like and haven't read. We speak out with our spoon-fed opinions, even though the decision doesn't affect us and we have no say in it. We no longer allow Nazi memorabilia to be bought and sold or even displayed, except at a courthouse in a rural southern county masked as a war memorial or on a public sidewalk protesting a drag show, but we all agreed Nazi stuff is a no-go, right? We all came together decades ago and agreed that the practice of white actors playing people of color with makeup, that ain't cool. And we've even come together and agreed that even in comedy or making a social point, seeing blackface depicted in any context harkens back to a very dark and shameful time in our past. I grew up knowing our nation's shame with blackface in Hollywood. I remember seeing the cartoons and the depictions growing up. I grew up with Brer Rabbit and his baby made of tar. That numbed me down enough that I wasn't the least bit bothered by Soul Man, an 80s film featuring C. Thomas Howell as a college student who loses his scholarship and decides to self-tan a little too long and slide in under the NAACP. It made it more about his experience not getting a scholarship more than another white guy taking another black opportunity. More currently, shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is about terrible, abysmal, amoral characters, has tried it. And if any show could pull it off in whatever context might be less harmful, if there even is any, Sunny. And even Sunny removed it from streaming because they realized it was harmful, hurtful, and so long as white supremacist groups are allowed to exist in America, there will never be a context that is appropriate. Even what wasn't all out frowned upon 5 years ago is now deemed unacceptable. And 10 years ago, 20, 50, 100. Humanity progresses beyond dangerous ideas. It's just getting everybody on board with what dangerous is. And of course, keeping people from being total assholes to each other through that transition. Perhaps there's a child who grew up a Disney fan, and so their perspective may forever be skewed by the notion that Doc must be older and wiser, white hair and all. So when that person seeks medical care, maybe he only trusts medical professionals who are more aged. Maybe that bias leads him away from a younger doctor who might stay up on top of trends, medications, and treatments more than, say, the conservative, traditionalist, older doctor. Maybe that younger doctor could have diagnosed his condition better. Maybe my example was a little ageist. We don't think about these things as trauma, but they can be very traumatic, in the sense that it's an event that leaves even the tiniest of little scars, or at least bruises, on our psyches, no less. Our perspective, certainly. On our decision-making process. Now, I know calling someone sneezy because they have allergies may not seem like an altogether horrible thing. I mean, come on, there are worse things to be than sneezy, right? Well, okay, maybe not post-pandemic, but from someone whose nose ran like a faucet as a kid, maybe I know a little thing or two about it. I had undiagnosed and mismanaged allergies, it turns out. It also turns out I could have remedied that with some over-the-counter medicine if anybody would have cared. It's just negative, and why put it out there calling somebody sneezy? I'm saying this little nugget was implanted in our minds at our most formative years when we learn how to be and how to treat others. We learn that it's not only okay and acceptable to label someone by their challenges, it's okay for those challenges to be defining of who we are. That singular, one-dimensional trait is their identity. Like Care Bears, Smurfs, or G.I. Joe. It isn't blaming Snow White, Disney, Hasbro, or anyone, really. It's understanding where some of our thought processes come from and acknowledging that it was from a different time without using that as an excuse. When you grow up with TV shows and movies and books that identify characters so superficially, it isn't surprising that we sometimes think of others one-dimensionally in real life. How many of you knew people with a nickname as a kid? Sleepy had an actual medical issue. Do we even realize how dangerous that is in a mining situation? And dopey? God forbid. Bashful? Look, as an adjective, it isn't insidious, but that's basically labeling a person's entire identity by their anxiety. Believe me, as someone who struggles with anxiety, we do that enough to ourselves. Look, I'm not even a big fan of labeling grumpy depressed. I got news for you here. Happy? He's probably depressed. Maybe bipolar. Maybe happy and grumpy are the same person. Maybe at least interchangeable. Tag teams. You be a jerk today and I'll smile. I'll get you next Thursday. And grumpy doesn't always mean depressed. Sometimes it just means I'm over your bullshit. Labeling. Judging. It's all just very problematic. This is a key jumping off point for the evolution of humanity and society. Right now is a challenging but potentially educational time, with my generation and especially the one before mine still around for this next, more woke generation to learn from. If we can have these difficult discussions, it's essential to progressing. My parents and grandparents enjoyed a generation of Gone with the Wind, cowboys and Indians, evil commies, and so many, many more at the time, seemingly harmless depictions. I argue that these indoctrinations have planted potentially toxic ideals in our society and in our minds. With Gone with the Wind and its creative liberties on the realities of the Civil War, from the depiction of African Americans to the depictions of women, men, and relationships, to old westerns even reinforcing negative indigenous or even masculinity stereotypes. I was scared to death of Russians when I was a kid. Red Dawn messed me up, man. These ideas influence our thoughts about so many subjects. I've mentioned before Aesop's lesson with the fox and the lion. Acquaintance weakens prejudice. The more you know. Now I know, and knowing is half the battle. Yo, Joe! When we know someone who is affected by the thing, it's harder for us to ignore the thing. The closer we are to that someone, the more impossible it becomes to ignore or even excuse the thing. When we consider other perspectives, we can come to some stronger conclusions about how we come together and unite as a people, regardless of labels. Except that we've allowed those labels, most of them, to be used as slurs. We've allowed our labels to divide us from the collective and segregate us into our respective groups and subgroups. Then we've allowed that to happen within our subgroups and so on and so forth. Our labels should divide us, within our respective subgroups and unite us into the collective, bringing an even stronger unity individually, socially, and as the greater collective. The more you know yourself, the more you know your neighbor. The more you know your neighbor, the more you know yourself. That's too hard. We're trained to seek out the popular stance or the devil's advocate. Pick a pen, right or wrong. We are conditioned to be suspicious of what is different or what we can't understand easily. We are door-dashed, that low-hanging fruit. We don't even have to reach these days. Yet, we aren't offered the equivalent training, conditioning, or exposure of ideas to contrast the negative, critical, or judgmental stereotypes. We aren't even encouraged toward compassion and empathy and kindness and mindfulness. Which leaves us where exactly? When I think about my dad, I think about a lot of things. But for this episode's topic, I look at my brother and myself and how our lives were negatively impacted by the ideas and stereotypes of toxic masculinity. My dad adopted my mother's 2 children from her first marriage, my brother and sister. A few years later, I arrived. My brother was never the model of masculinity, especially as a kid. He wasn't the least bit feminine. He just wasn't manly. He was quiet and shy. He was a mama's boy, sweet. Had a lazy eye when he was little, aloof. He probably would have been diagnosed on the spectrum under today's scientific understandings. He was far more interested in Star Wars than car parts. Daddy wanted a football player. He ended up with an Atari player. In fact, the closest my brother ever came to the game of football was probably one of those tabletop vibrating games where you shoved the little cotton ball under the player's arm and turned the table on, covered your ears, and waited to see if it was the blue Cowboys player or the red Redskins player to make it across the end zone. Well, thankfully, that team finally got the message and changed their name, even if the racist owner passive-aggressively just changed it to Washington Football Team for a few years. But if we look at the toxic portrayals of this nation's indigenous peoples throughout our lives, it's easy to see where we've missed the beauty, majesty, and the true complexities of their cultures, and how that was whitewashed to form the foundations of our nation and our cultural standard of normalized dehumanization of others. Colonial genocide. All in the name of Christian conversion and American expansion, imperialism, and industrialization. It applies to what I'm talking about, but it could be its own separate episode. If you don't have an opinion on whether the now Washington Commanders should have changed their name, maybe you should examine your own early biases toward our land's indigenous peoples. Then, examine that timeline compared to America's slavery and emancipation, and you'll see a harrowing history of hatred. I wasn't exposed to many positive representations, even though I have Cherokee heritage. My father certainly didn't do much to enforce the idea to me and my brother that all men were created equal. A lesson I learned once from my brother, once he finally got away from my dad. One time, after the divorce, Robbie had gone to live with my mom in metropolitan Nashville, Tennessee. When I was probably in my early teens, I made a racially insensitive joke using a racially insensitive stereotypical accent. My brother got mad and told me that wasn't how that group of people really talked, and that was just my daddy's racist small-town bullshit brainwashing. I admired my big brother. He was a role model. Not in all the right ways, mind you, but he was my big brother, and I looked up to him. What he said to me mattered, so I didn't do that again. And when my dad did, I called him on it. I found out why what I did wasn't funny, how it was hurtful. My brother taught me about humanity and comedy that day. He taught me about indoctrination. Would you talk like that in front of them? That hit me pretty hard. Thanks to my brother's boldness, I started seeing things much differently than I had before under my dad's ill humor. Maybe that's part of how I didn't end up like so many sworn over to the cult. Imagine if my brother had just rolled his eyes, hiding his disappointment in who I was, and didn't bring it up. I would have kept on with that behavior. For how long? That's how stereotypes get broken, chipped away. It wasn't a whole transformation right then and there. What it took me longer to realize was that it took my brother leaving my father's grasp, that atmosphere, and those small, racist southern towns my father insisted on limiting himself to be the kind of person who could call his baby brother's problematic copycat behavior out. I was a young teenager at best. My brother and I had a lot in common growing up, mostly because I wanted to be like him. Maybe what made my brother see others in a more humane way was being bullied by someone who didn't see people that way. Maybe that's just what made him boldly intolerant of the behavior. So my dad wanted a son to carry his legacy and family name. I have no knowledge on the subject of how the family I was born into began, except to say that I wouldn't be surprised if my dad pushed the adoption of my older siblings, at least partially so his kids would have his name. Because back then, a blended family probably meant something much different socially than it does today. It was the Brady bunch, not the Brady-Martin bunch, after all. Some sort of antiquated patriarchy thing, I'm sure. Ownership kink. My dad was hard on my brother. They clashed. Robbie didn't act like Daddy figured a boy should act. No, Robbie wasn't gay, believe me. I gave Daddy enough of those vibes for the both of us. My brother was just softer, lazier, less interested in being an electrician than in taking the electronic device apart, learning how it worked, and putting it back together again. My brother was bloody brilliant in a way maybe the world wasn't ready for. Certainly in a way my dad wasn't ready for. Not boasting, but all three of us have minds that work in unique ways that maybe if my brother had lived and we could have overcome our traumas, the three of us could have ruled the multiverse or some shit. My brother, the conniving and cunning engineer-minded, rooted in theoretical physics and string theory shit. My sister, the earth goddess warrior empath. Me, the unlucky troubled fuck that kind of got it all and can't handle it. Makes for a good story anyway. I'm being flip, but with a slightly less obstructive and destructive path laid out before us, my brother would be alive and the three of us would have thrived. We all would. But we are so caught up in our words, our labels, our slurs, being better or above others. It speaks to the gravity of potential lost in the rural, uneducated South. My father, nor the atmospheres we ever grew up in, appreciated intellectuals, deep thinkers, or those who sought understanding. My father certainly wasn't equipped to foster whatever intellect the three of us might have had. My mother? I've covered that a bit before. She was caught up in surviving my father. Can't fault her for that. She did her best given the circumstances. My brother just didn't align with my dad's or society's ideals all the time when it came to masculinity. Not until he got older, and even then, that masculinity became toxic, almost overcompensating for the prepubescent era's awkwardness. Let's break it down for a moment. My dad's view of masculinity was influenced by something. Words, specifically, labels, singular, superficial identifiers, but moreover, those were bred more socially, or were they from his own father's ideals, cultural norms, or generational hand-me-down traumas? The way Daddy was teased growing up for having a glass eye since he was 14, the way he felt like maybe he missed out on being a man because he couldn't join the military or play contact sports, maybe too many John Wayne movies. I discussed this earlier in this series when I did an informal case study of my father, seeking to understand where he would stand on today's socio-political climate. My father was traumatized by toxic ideals of what a man should be, and when he didn't measure up to those unrealistic ideals, couldn't measure up due to a tragic accident, well, it impacted the way he saw the world and later in life, how he raised his kids. I'm not sure we measured up either. Dad was proud of us and loved us, yes, without doubt. My brother undoubtedly, though, was traumatized by my dad, consciously or subconsciously, for not living up to Dad's expectations. Maybe not physically abusive so much all the time, but Daddy could pick and tease, and knowing what I know about sarcasm and how it impacts children, how teasing affects children, those cuts left lasting and immeasurable scars. I know better than to assign blame for a tragedy like suicide, but hard facts are what they are. Who knows how much damage was done by that constant teasing and how it impacted my brother's decision-making throughout his life, but certainly there at the very end before he took his own life. His self-worth, his confidence, his strength. I have no idea except to say that even if there's blame, it isn't all my dad's fault. With suicide, just as with everything else, there are many different perspectives and details that contribute to it. We rarely stop to consider that suicide is the extreme result of bullying and abuse. Well, that or channeling all that trauma into inflicting pain on others. We know this scientific fact. Yet we keep feeding at the trough of toxicity and abuse at the expense of others with no regard for the consequences. One of the things I've considered heavily is how my own mental health growing up was directly tied to feelings of fear, insecurity, and, well, things that might have been prevented with just a little more knowledge in how people operate. Exposure, diversity. Acquaintance weakens prejudice. Not just with people and stereotypes, but with ideas. My unwavering loyalty to my father prevented me from seeing a lot of his behavior as toxic or abusive. That prevented me from understanding how, even when in my mind I thought I had evolved or taken the next step away from that behavior, I still hadn't fully come to the understanding that even in humor or sarcasm, there is trauma expressed and inflicted in all directions. I think about that a lot. The ripple effects of my humor, my personality, my past. I think about what drives us to make the choices we make. That's why I started overthinking everything. What I found is that sometimes we make decisions as 40-something-year-olds that directly lead back to something that happened when we were 5. Textbook psychology, sure, but looking at it from different perspectives, if we never step back to think about it, much less from another viewpoint, well, that's where we wash, rinse, and repeat our mistakes. What's interesting is that when someone takes their own life, the survivors are left surviving, trying to make sense of it. We can sit around after and talk about all the struggles and trials, tribulations, and factors that may have played into it. Yet we struggle to have those conversations to show that same compassion when someone is alive. I wonder why that is. Why do we as a society wait until it's too late to realize there's a problem? Why couldn't we just listen when a guy kneeled for a song? Why did we have to get all in our feels that masked the facts? We couldn't see people as people or even acknowledge their struggle. That is the American tale. Why are we the way we are? How do we reckon a society that's more obsessed with being right than being ethical, winning over fairness? How do we foster progress and change on any level when we're stuck in this seemingly never-ending cycle of abuse? What does it say about our evolution as a species? Our society as a whole? Humanity on this planet and the hope for the future? If we, the people, can't stop laughing at the expense of others, calling names and categorizing people before offering any compassion, when we're more interested in laughing at someone's struggles than we are handing them a life preserver? When we know that among suicides, the vast majority of them, if not every single one, are rooted in mental health. So many cases of self-harm on any level boil down to the names people call us. Who are we? Seriously. And why are we, the people, just now starting to collectively come around? Well, there's always been a problem with the Seven Dwarfs and Gone with the Wind, Song of the South, John Wayne old westerns, and yes, even a few Dr. Seuss books. Children's toys, pancakes, syrup, and starchy sides. We haven't all recognized it until today. Even people didn't recognize it before now, and people still don't recognize it. Not enough people were willing to admit these things that were important to them for whatever reason were somehow toxic to others. Because what does it say about the people who exposed us to these toxic things? What does it say about those people who didn't say anything at all? What does it say about us for not saying something sooner? Our parents, people who aren't here to defend themselves. It's a good thing this is happening. Uncomfortable as hell, but sometimes change is uncomfortable, especially when it's necessary. Just like my dad, he had no idea how detrimental some of that humor and some of that behavior could be. He was just being funny. He's just giving us a hard time. Kind of like I gave my daughters a hard time growing up. This isn't a knock on anyone's personality. This is a statement on understanding the intricacies of human development. Just like walking around calling someone sneezy, dopey, or take the Smurfs for another example. Labeling an individual for a trait, especially one we can't help, is toxic and psychologically traumatic. It's no jokey. It boxes us in. And when that box opens, it blows up in our faces, in reality and in our minds. And it makes it easier to box other people in as well. We know that now. But we grew up on these shows and products and characters, and it's hard to argue some of those values didn't rub off a little. Coming up, I'm continuing this discussion on the ideas behind wokeism, bullying, snowflake sensitivity, political correctness, and cancel culture. But I'm looking at that through a slightly different lens than I have before now. Following the last half of this season up to now, I've been discussing the effects of pop culture, entertainment, and infotainment media, and how it's impacted our collective narcissism as a society. How the culture of cultism we all experienced growing up led us down the paths of some fandom for some very problematic ideas our primitive little brains weren't prepared to process. Strap in and hop on the trolley as we head to the land of Matrix make-believe, strapped in like Alex, eyes wide open, mind shut like a trap, while I overthink everything about our childhood, the cartoons and programs we watched, and how they dumbed us down and numbed us down. As I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, is on Amazon. You can link through it through joshbrandonmedia.com. You can check out some of my new music. It's on iTunes. And check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music under Sir Talks a Lot, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out my merch store. Get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot merch store. And also, we got more products coming soon, bumper stickers, mugs, all kinds of stuff. Follow me everywhere you can online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel wherever you're watching it or listening to it. Look, do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. You'll grow with me. And if you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App or check out the store on my site and peruse my other products. Don't forget to sign up for my email list too. I'm always coming out with new stuff. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.